Colonel Ithran Cass had cracked 41 distinct human communication networks in the 6 weeks since the Zephyrian Compact's arrival, and every single one had fallen apart within days. The 42nd network took him 3 months, defeated 3 separate cryptographic AI cores, and turned out to be run entirely by a 79-year-old woman with a hearing aid and a garage full of vacuum tube radios. Her name was Elinor Kowalczyk, though the resistance networks that eventually spanned 4 continents simply called her Nell, and the Zephyrian Compact would spend the rest of its occupation of Earth's northern hemisphere trying to understand how a grandmother in rural Montana had built something their most sophisticated signals intelligence division could neither crack nor fully destroy. The invasion had proceeded in its opening weeks, exactly according to Compact doctrine. Orbital dominance established within days. Major population centers pacified through the systematic disruption of digital infrastructure, a strategy that had proven devastatingly effective against every previous species the Compact had encountered. Populations so thoroughly dependent on centralized digital networks that severing those networks reliably produced immediate social and military paralysis. Earth cities fell into exactly the kind of disorganized confusion Compact strategists had projected. Communication grids dark, coordination collapsing, resistance fragmenting into isolated, easily neutralized pockets. What Compact intelligence had not adequately weighted, buried in a research footnote nobody in the invasion's planning division had considered strategically relevant, was that a substantial and stubbornly persistent subculture of human civilization had spent nearly a century maintaining communication technology, specifically designed to function without any of the infrastructure the Compact had just destroyed. Amateur radio operators, hobbyists, mostly elderly, scattered across rural communities, the Compact's initial occupation had barely bothered to garrison, running equipment so far beneath the Compact's threat assessment threshold that it hadn't warranted a single line in the invasion's comprehensive technological survey. Nell Kowalczyk had been licensed for 53 years. She had built her first radio at 14, in a farmhouse basement in a town so small it didn't appear on most maps, taught by a father who had served as a radio operator in a war 2 generations before the Compact ever entered Earth's system. She had spent 5 decades since then doing what amateur radio operators the world over did, quietly, patiently, without any expectation that the skill would ever matter for anything beyond the particular satisfaction of bouncing a signal off the ionosphere and reaching another enthusiast on the far side of the planet. When Compact forces severed Earth's digital infrastructure, Nell Kowalczyk's garage, and several hundred garages and basements just like it scattered across the continent, remained fully, quietly operational. It began small, in the first chaotic week, nothing more than Nell relaying messages between isolated families who had lost contact with relatives in nearby towns, the kind of modest, humanitarian communication work that had always been amateur radio's quiet, unglamorous purpose during natural disasters. It grew, over the following month, into something considerably larger, as scattered pockets of organized human resistance discovered, through word passed hand to hand in a world suddenly starved of digital connection, that a network of elderly hobbyists with outdated equipment represented the only reliable, continent-spanning communication infrastructure still functioning beneath Compact detection. Colonel Ithran Cass first encountered the network's existence 4 weeks into the occupation, reviewing an intelligence report that flagged unexplained radio frequency activity across a pattern too geographically dispersed and too technologically primitive to fit any conventional resistance communication model his species had previously encountered. "This cannot represent coordinated resistance activity," he told his signals intelligence chief, a methodical Zephyrian officer named Vesan Thrau, reviewing data that showed radio transmissions using modulation techniques his own species' technology had considered obsolete for centuries. The technology is too primitive. Our own communication doctrine abandoned equivalent methods generations before we achieved interstellar capability. No serious resistance movement would organize around infrastructure this rudimentary. I agree the technology is primitive, Colonel, Vesson said, but the pattern suggests otherwise. We are detecting relay activity across distances and terrain that should be impossible given the power output these transmissions register at. Someone is coordinating a signal relay network, manually, across a geographic footprint that would normally require infrastructure we have already destroyed. Colonel Cass authorized a dedicated signals intelligence effort to identify and disrupt the network within the week, expecting, based on 41 previous successful campaigns against equivalent human resistance infrastructure, a straightforward operation. His forces had cracked encrypted digital networks running considerably more sophisticated cryptographic protection. A network built on technology his own species had abandoned before achieving spaceflight seemed, by any reasonable assessment, a trivial challenge by comparison. It took his signals division 6 weeks simply to map the network's basic structure, a discovery that generated considerable professional frustration within a division accustomed to rapid, decisive success against human communication infrastructure. The network's resilience, they gradually determined, stemmed not from sophisticated technology, which it conspicuously lacked, but from a structural design that compact conquest doctrine had never previously needed to counter. Nell Kowalczyk and the scattered network of amateur operators she had begun quietly coordinating, operated on a principal amateur radio culture, had developed decades earlier for reasons that had nothing whatsoever to do with military resistance, redundancy, decentralization, and a communication protocol built around manual relay rather than any centralized hub a conventional strike could eliminate. There is no headquarters to target, Vesson Thrall reported, 6 weeks into an operation that should, by compact doctrine, have concluded within days. Every node in this network operates independently, capable of relaying messages without any dependency on a central coordinating authority. We have identified and neutralized 11 individual transmission sites. The network's overall functionality shows no measurable degradation. Messages continue reaching their destinations through alternate relay paths that reconfigure faster than our targeting cycle can adapt to them. Someone is coordinating this network's overall strategy, Colonel Cass said, reviewing intercepted traffic that suggested, despite the network's decentralized technical structure, a level of organizational sophistication that implied genuine strategic direction rather than simple ad hoc improvisation. Identify the coordinating authority. It took his intelligence division another 5 weeks to trace enough traffic patterns back to a single point of origin, a modest farmhouse property outside a small Montana town, registered to a 79-year-old retired schoolteacher and widow who had, according to every conventional threat assessment metric compact intelligence had ever developed, absolutely no business representing a strategic priority. Colonel Cass authorized a direct reconnaissance and capture operation, expecting, based on the target's demographic profile, a straightforward extraction requiring minimal resources. What his forces encountered instead, arriving at Nell Kowalczyk's property with a small tactical team calibrated for what intelligence still described as a low-risk civilian target, was a woman who met them at her front door with the same unhurried, unbothered composure she might have shown unexpected guests arriving during dinner preparation, and a farmhouse basement that told a story their intelligence assessment had entirely failed to anticipate. "You'll want to see the radio room, I expect," she said, before the tactical team's lead officer had spoken a single word, her tone carrying the particular patient exasperation of someone who had clearly expected this visit considerably earlier than it had actually arrived. "Might as well come in properly instead of standing around on the porch. Mind the dog. She doesn't like strangers much, but she won't bite unless I tell her to. The tactical team's lead officer, a young Zephyrian soldier named Cressavethiri, who had participated in 11 previous successful resistance extractions across the occupation's first 2 months, found herself, disconcertingly, following Nell Kowalczyk's directions into the farmhouse with a compliance her training had never specifically prepared her to question. The basement radio room told its own story before Nell said another word. Shelves of equipment, decades old, meticulously maintained, arranged with the particular careful organization of someone who understood every piece intimately. Logbooks stretching back years, filled with the small, precise handwriting of someone who had spent a lifetime documenting contacts across a hobby most of humanity had long since considered a charming anachronism. And more concerning to the tactical team's intelligence specialist reviewing the room with mounting professional alarm, evidence of a coordination effort considerably more sophisticated than the network's primitive technology had suggested was possible. You've been running the Resistance's entire continental communication network from this room, Cressavethiri said, processing an intelligence picture that violated nearly every threat assessment principle her training had emphasized. I've been relaying messages, Nell said, settling into a worn chair beside her main transmitter with the particular comfort of someone entirely at home in her own space, regardless of who else currently occupied it. That's all any of us have ever really done, dear. I don't run anything, not the way you're probably imagining. Nobody gives me orders and nobody takes orders from me either. We just pass messages along, the way ham radio operators have always done during emergencies, going back to well before you folks ever showed up. Turns out an entire continent full of stubborn old hobbyists with outdated equipment is harder to shut down than a fancy digital network, because there's no single switch to flip. You can't turn off something that was never centralized in the first place. Yet our analysis indicates strategic coordination beyond simple message relay, Cressa said. Someone is directing resistance activity through this network with clear tactical purpose. Nell Kowalczyk considered the accusation with the same unhurried patience she had brought to every exchange since the tactical team's arrival, and offered an answer that would, in the following weeks, become one of the most extensively analyzed statements in the Compact's entire occupation intelligence archive. I taught school for 31 years, dear, she said. 3rd grade mostly. You spend 3 decades teaching 8-year-olds. You learn a thing or two about organizing people who don't necessarily want to be organized, without ever needing to actually be in charge of anybody. I don't direct anything. I just ask good questions and I pass along what I hear, and I make sure the folks running supplies know what the folks running lookouts have seen, and vice versa. Everybody out there fighting your occupation, they're figuring out their own strategy just fine on their own. I just help them talk to each other, same as I've been doing with radio operators clear across the globe for 50 years, long before any of this started. Turns out that's a more useful skill in a war than anybody, including me, ever expected it to be. Colonel Ithran Cass, reviewing the full transcript of his tactical team's encounter with Nell Kowalczyk, found himself confronting a strategic problem his considerable conquest doctrine had genuinely never previously required him to solve. The Compact's entire approach to resistance suppression depended on identifying and eliminating centralized coordination points, a doctrine refined across dozens of successful campaigns against species whose resistance movements, however determined, ultimately depended on hierarchical command structures vulnerable to decapitation strikes. Nell Kowalczyk represented something his doctrine had no established protocol for addressing, a coordination function that operated without hierarchy, without central authority, and most unsettlingly, without any single point of failure his forces could target to produce the network's collapse. Detain her, he ordered, 6 days after the initial reconnaissance operation, authorizing what his intelligence division assured him would finally, decisively disrupt the Resistance's continental communication capability. Whatever function she serves within this network, removing the coordinating individual should produce measurable degradation in the network's overall coherence, regardless of its decentralized technical structure. The detention proceeded without incident. Nell Kowalczyk offered no resistance, submitting to compact custody with the same unbothered composure she had shown throughout the entire encounter, a compliance that struck Colonel Cass. Reviewing the operation's records, as considerably more concerning than active resistance would have been. The network's overall functionality, monitored closely in the days following her detention, showed almost no measurable degradation whatsoever. This should not be possible, Wessenthal reported, 10 days into Nell Kowalczyk's detention, presenting data that contradicted every strategic projection his division had developed. Message relay activity has continued across the network's full geographic footprint with only marginal reduction in overall traffic volume. Whatever coordination function this individual served, the network appears to have adapted around her absence with remarkable speed. Colonel Cass requested a formal interrogation, hoping to extract intelligence that might finally provide his forces the strategic leverage his doctrine assumed should already exist. What he received instead, sitting across from a 79-year-old grandmother who met his questions with the same patient, unhurried composure she had shown from the very first moment of contact, was an education in exactly what his species' considerable conquest experience had never previously required them to understand. You believe your removal from the network should have produced significant strategic disruption, Cass said, through the careful, formal register his diplomatic training emphasized for high-value interrogation subjects. Our intelligence assessment indicated you served a critical coordination function, yet the network continues operating with minimal degradation despite your absence. Explain this discrepancy. I could have told you that would happen if you'd asked, Nell said, though I don't suppose you would have believed me before you saw it yourselves. See, that's the whole point of how we built this thing, dear, even if none of us sat down and planned it out that carefully at the start. Nobody's irreplaceable because everybody's been taught the same basic skills. I didn't just relay messages. I trained 15 other people how to do exactly what I do, the same way somebody trained me 50 years ago, back when this was just a hobby and none of us ever imagined it'd matter for anything more than talking to strangers on the other side of the world for fun. You take me out of the network, somebody else picks up the slack within days, because that's how we've always done things. Nobody's the linchpin. That was the whole point, even before any of us knew we'd need a point like that. You are suggesting the network was deliberately designed to resist decapitation strategy, Cass said, despite predating our arrival by decades, developed for purposes entirely unrelated to organized resistance against a technologically superior invasion force. I'm suggesting something simpler than that, honestly, Nell said. Ham radio operators have always believed in exactly one thing above everything else. When the regular systems fail, when the power's out and the phone lines are down and everything modern and efficient stops working, somebody somewhere needs to still be able to get a message through. We built our whole culture around that idea, decades before your fleet ever showed up in our sky. Redundancy. Everybody trained to do everybody else's job. No single point where the whole thing falls apart if one person can't keep going. We didn't build that to fight you, Colonel. We built it because emergencies happen, and good people don't wait around for permission to help their neighbors when the regular channels stop working. Turns out that same instinct works just fine against an alien occupation too. We just had to widen the definition of emergency a little. Colonel Ithran Cass's formal assessment of the incident, submitted to Compact High Command 4 months into an occupation that had, by that point, generated considerably more sustained resistance than any previous campaign in the Compact's recorded conquest history, represented a fundamental reconsideration of assumptions his species' considerable strategic doctrine had never previously needed to question. Our conquest doctrine depends fundamentally on identifying and eliminating centralized coordination structures within resistance movements, he wrote. A strategy refined across decades of successful campaigns against species whose organizational culture, whether military or civilian, consistently produces hierarchical command structures vulnerable to targeted disruption. Earth's amateur radio culture, developed across nearly a century for reasons entirely unrelated to military resistance, has produced something our doctrine has no established framework for countering: a coordination network built around radical redundancy and distributed expertise, where no single individual's removal produces meaningful strategic degradation, because the network's entire design philosophy assumes, as a foundational principle developed decades before our arrival, that any single point of coordination might fail and must therefore never become irreplaceable. We detain the individual our intelligence identified as the network's primary coordinating authority, expecting significant disruption to resistance communication capability. We observed instead a network that adapted within days, redistributing coordination function across a network of trained replacements. This individual had, by her own account, spent years deliberately cultivating for exactly this contingency, though she insists this cultivation predated any awareness that alien invasion would ever require it. I do not believe conventional decapitation strategy will prove effective against resistance infrastructure built on this specific organizational model. I believe, based on everything my forces have observed across 4 months of sustained, but ultimately unsuccessful disruption efforts, that we are confronting a resistance communication network specifically resilient to exactly the kind of strategic approach our considerable conquest experience has always relied upon. Nell Kowalczyk remained in compact custody for 11 months, a detention that generated, throughout that period, considerably more political complication for the occupying force than her captors had originally anticipated. Human resistance networks across the continent, rather than fragmenting in her absence as compact strategic doctrine had predicted, appeared to draw renewed organizational cohesion from her detention, her continued imprisonment becoming, in the words of one intelligence assessment that generated considerable internal compact debate, a unifying symbol around which decentralized resistance elements have organized increasingly sophisticated coordinated action. Precisely the opposite outcome our detention strategy was designed to produce. She was released ultimately, as part of a broader prisoner exchange negotiated during the fragile ceasefire that eventually concluded the compact's occupation of Earth's northern hemisphere, returning to a farmhouse property that resistance networks across the continent had, in her absence, quietly maintained exactly as she had left it, radio equipment intact. Logbooks continued in her absence by operators she had trained years before any of them understood why that training would eventually matter. She resumed her place within the network without ceremony, the same unhurried, patient presence she had always been, relaying messages, training new operators, maintaining a culture of redundancy and distributed capability that had, over the following years, become the subject of extensive study not merely within compact strategic circles, but within Earth's own military academies. Eager to understand exactly what principle had allowed a network of elderly hobbyists to accomplish what considerably more sophisticated digital infrastructure had failed to achieve. "People keep asking me what the secret was," she told a young military historian who tracked her down years later, long after the occupation's formal conclusion, finding her exactly where she had always been, in the same basement radio room, still maintaining contact with operators across a world that had, by then, fully rebuilt the digital infrastructure the occupation had once destroyed. "Like there's some clever strategy I came up with, some brilliant plan I executed. There wasn't, not really. I just did what ham radio operators have always done, going back generations before any of this happened. I taught people. I made sure nobody was irreplaceable, because irreplaceable people are exactly the kind the other side knows to target first. And I trusted, the same way you have to trust when you're teaching a room full of 8-year-olds anything worth knowing, that if you teach it well enough, and you teach enough people, the thing you built keeps going even after you're not the one holding it together anymore. That's not a military secret, dear. That's just good teaching. Turns out good teaching wins wars sometimes, same as it does everything else. If you're patient enough to do it properly and stubborn enough to keep doing it even when nobody thinks it matters yet. She continued running her small corner of the network for another 6 years, training new generations of operators long after the Compact's formal withdrawal from Earth's system, insisting, whenever asked, that nothing she had done during the occupation represented anything more remarkable than what amateur radio culture had always quietly practiced, decades before anyone imagined it would matter for anything beyond the simple, patient satisfaction of making sure a message could always find its way through, no matter what stood in its path. The Zephyrian Compact's formal strategic doctrine, revised extensively in the years following the Earth occupation's conclusion, included a new classification category that Colonel Ithran Cass, in his own extensive post-occupation writings, would insist on naming specifically after the woman whose farmhouse basement had taught his entire species, something their 3,000 years of conquest experience had never previously required them to learn. Distributed resilient structures, he wrote, in a passage that would become required study across compact military academies for the following generation, represent the single most significant tactical development our conquest doctrine has encountered in recorded history, a coordination model that abandons hierarchy entirely in favor of radical redundancy and distributed expertise, rendering conventional decapitation strategy not merely ineffective, but actively counterproductive. We spent 3,000 years perfecting the art of identifying and eliminating the person at the top of any resistant structure. We were entirely unprepared for a species that had, across one small but stubbornly persistent subculture, spent nearly a century deliberately building networks specifically designed to ensure there was no top to eliminate at all, only a wide, patient, endlessly replaceable foundation of ordinary people who had simply decided, individually and collectively, that no single one of them would ever be allowed to become the reason everyone else stopped being able to talk to each other. I do not believe we will encounter another species with quite this particular vulnerability or quite this particular strength again. I believe, having spent considerable time in the presence of the woman who embodied it most completely, that this represents something considerably more specific to humanity's own hard-won historical wisdom about what happens when a people decide, deliberately and repeatedly across their own turbulent history, that survival depends on making sure everyone knows enough to keep going, even when the person who taught them is no longer there to lead the way.